Hello, and welcome to another vlog. Today we're talking about weed. More specifically, we're talking about medical marijuana. And of course, today's video is for educational purposes only. I'd like to spend the duration of today's vlog talking a little bit about the difference between medical marijuana and recreational cannabis, and talking about the different types of cannabis. Now, I myself have actually considered speaking to my doctor about using cannabis for medicinal purposes, because although I know it wouldn't do much to improve my general health, I do think it could potentially help me manage some of my anxieties, many of which are related to my health. And the reason I bring that up is because I think it's essential to speak to your doctor before using cannabis for medicinal purposes. Because at the end of the day, medical marijuana is a medication, and just like all other medications and treatments, it is crucial to consult with your doctor before starting on your treatment. And one of the reasons this is especially important is because although using cannabis is generally safe, for individuals with certain health conditions, it's important to take certain considerations into account before using cannabis for medicinal purposes or otherwise, because some strains of cannabis can cause side effects which could be harmful to individuals with certain health conditions. So, for example, there are some strains of cannabis which can cause an irregular heartbeat, which could be harmful to individuals such as myself who live with certain heart conditions. And that's why it's so important to consult with your doctor before using medicinal cannabis and to obtain that cannabis from a medical dispensary. Because medical cannabis and recreational cannabis are very, very different. Um, Medicinal cannabis is intended to treat a wide range of health conditions and to manage some of their symptoms, whereas recreational cannabis is intended for people's own enjoyment. So they have different purposes, and therefore, because they are very different, they need to be treated differently. Um, you'd go to a recreational dispensary to purchase cannabis for recreational purposes, and then to a medical dispensary to purchase cannabis for medicinal purposes. Because they have two separate purposes, it's important to treat them differently. And it makes sense because if you go to a company that specializes in recreational marijuana to purchase cannabis, they're not really qualified to provide you with medical advice because they aren't doctors or healthcare providers. But if you go to a company that specializes in medical marijuana, they're going to be a lot more knowledgeable about that. And just to really give you an idea, I went to the Nova Scotia Liquor Corporation, the retailer in Nova Scotia which is authorized to sell cannabis for recreational purposes. Cannabis was recently legalized in Canada back in October, for those of you who may be unaware of that. Anyway, I went to the NSLC and I went to the cannabis section and spoke to one of the employees. And she told me that because the NSLC is selling cannabis for recreational purposes, they are not allowed to give medical advice. And it makes sense because although the employees at NSLC are very knowledgeable about their product, they are not healthcare providers, and therefore it stands to reason that they don't know a lot about people's diagnosis and aren't really qualified to give medical advice. But a company that sells medical marijuana probably is a lot more qualified for that. Interestingly enough, Shoppers Drug Mart was recently granted permission to sell medicinal cannabis online. And the reason I mention these things is because it really drives home my point that medicinal cannabis and recreational cannabis are very different. And that leads me directly to the next thing that I want to talk about, which is the different types of cannabis. So I'm going to be talking about 4 different strains of cannabis. I'll talk about each one briefly, what they are and what some of their characteristics are. So the 4 I'm going to be talking about are cannabis sativa, cannabis indica, cannabis ruderalis, and then hybrid strains of cannabis. So the first strain of cannabis I want to talk about is cannabis sativa. Now, cannabis sativa comes in the form of tall plants with narrow leaves and is native to Central and South America as well as Southeast Asia. It has high amounts of THC, which is the chemical in cannabis which is associated with its psychoactive properties, and so for that reason it has a very uplifting and energetic effect, but it can also cause paranoia and irregular heartbeats, kind of like I mentioned earlier, and for that reason it's mainly only used for recreational purposes. The next strain is Cannabis indica. Now, Cannabis indica comes in the form of much smaller plants with broad leaves and is native to North and East Asia, specifically the hash producing countries of the world. So we're talking countries like Afghanistan and Nepal. It contains a lot less THC than cannabis sativa, but contains a lot more CBD, which is the chemical in cannabis which is associated with its relaxing properties. And so for that reason, cannabis indica tends to have a much more calming and relaxing effect than cannabis sativa does. And for that reason, it is more often used for things like pain relief. And then the next kind of cannabis is Cannabis ruderalis. Now, Cannabis ruderalis comes in the form of very small plants with narrow leaves and is native to central Russia. So as you can imagine, it's very resilient to the cold and is suitable for growing in climates that are colder. So for example, in countries like Canada or other countries that have colder climates. It has very little THC and quite a bit of CBD. And so for that reason, it's used almost entirely for medicinal purposes, which makes sense because CBD is the chemical in cannabis, which is most often associated with the health benefits of cannabis use. And then finally, there's the hybrid strains of cannabis. Now, there are many different strains of hybrid cannabis. Basically, when people talk about hybrid strains of cannabis, they're talking about any strain of cannabis which is the result of combining two or more different species of cannabis, breeding them together. And like I said, there are many different varieties of hybrid cannabis. There's some sativa dominant and some indica dominant and pretty much everything in between. And hybrid cannabis tends to be bred for a specific purpose, to create a certain effect and to give the user a specific feeling. Right, so pretty much every strain of hybrid cannabis has a different effect. And odds are when you go to a dispensary and you purchase cannabis, you're probably getting a hybrid strain. You're probably not getting pure sativa or indica cannabis. Right, but that's not necessarily a bad thing because, like I said, they are bred to have a specific effect, right? So by purchasing a hybrid strain, you're more likely to get a strain that meets your specific needs, which is especially important if you're using cannabis for medicinal purposes because, obviously you want it to have its desired effect. And of course, hybrid strains of cannabis tend to have some really cool names. So that's just a brief overview of the different types of cannabis. And I do feel like this should go without saying, but I want to stress that you should never drive or operate heavy machinery after smoking cannabis. There is never, ever an excuse to get behind the wheel when you are high. Don't be the person who destroys another human being's life because you were too lazy or stubborn to find an alternate way home. You can take an Uber or a taxi, or you can get a friend to drive you, or you can even just stay home. It's never acceptable to get behind the wheel when you're high. Not only is it illegal, it's also reckless. So please don't do it. Anyway, on Thursday I'll be releasing a video in which I talk more about what medicinal cannabis is, what it's used for, and who benefits from it. So subscribe if you want to see that video. And be sure to follow Squeaky Wheel Productions on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And as always, if you enjoyed today's vlog and you want to see more videos like this one, then please support me on Patreon. Anyway, thanks for watching and see you on Thursday.